Okay, welcome back to the Salvation History series from the Holy Family of Nazareth Catholic Church here in Irving, Texas. Today, for the first time, we will be leaving the realm of Scripture and going into the realm of history. Well, of course, Scripture is history as well, but now we are in the realm without a particular Scripture to guide us. We're reading just normal history. And so we're going to start here. We're starting with the early church. And we'll start with this phrase, all things in common, because that's how it was in the early church. Right. So we'll first have to understand a conflict here between pagan and Christian charity. They were really competing ideas. Now, for the pagans, what we would call charity would be more like philanthropy. It established a benefactor-client relationship. Hence, it established this dependency. And it was used as a way to purchase honor. So, a rich man would distribute food, okay, to citizens, not to slaves or people like that, because who cares if they honored you? Or he would sponsor games at the Colosseum to entertain the public. This was a way of buying honor. It extended only to freemen, not to slaves and not to the destitute. They didn't care about those. Who cares if the slave honors you or the pauper honors you? That's not important. And it excluded systemic reform. All right, Christian charity is quite different. Christian charity is about serving the least of my brothers. And this comes from Matthew, well, it comes from all over the gospel, but it's especially important in Matthew 25:31 to 46, because that's where Jesus describes the last judgment. And guess what? In this last judgment, there's only one question asked. What did you do for these, the least of my brothers? So, charity here is both obligatory and voluntary. It's a duty we have to our fellow man, but nobody can force you to do it. It has to be done freely out of your heart. So, this kind of charity has to become an inner need, not a way to purchase honor. But there are precedents in the prophets and in the Essenes. So, this is not completely new. But in Judaism, but it's new in the way Christ expresses it and in the way the early church expresses it. So we start with the Jerusalem community. Now this is in Acts 4:32 to 36. It's a voluntary communism, or it would be better to call it communalism. The community is then scattered by persecutions. But now this mentioned once in Acts, but was that just an exception, or were these communities the norm? Well, we read in Justin Martyr, who's writing about the year 150 BC, so more than 100 years after these events. And those who are well to do and willing give what each thinks fit, and what is collected is deposited with the president, who succors the orphans and widows, and those who, through sickness or other cause, are in want, and those who are in bonds, and the strangers sojourning among us, and in a word, takes care of all of those who are in need. That's Justin Martyr. So, widows and orphans. Widows and orphans occupy a special place. Um, a woman without a husband, as we've mentioned before, is in a very precarious position. Um, she is almost certainly to be part of the poor. And of course, the same applies to orphans. Now, in the year 200, Tertullian, another early Christian, says, "We hold all things in common except our wives." But the greatest testimony of how the early Christians operated comes from a pagan author and comic. He's sort of, Lucian is sort of the stand-up comic of his day. He's a satirist. He lives in the years 125 to 180. And he writes this satirical novel about Christians called The Passing of Peregrinus. And means pilgrim. Peregrinus is a con man. So he visits Christian communities and lives at their expense. Lucian writes, "The poor fools have persuaded themselves above all that they are immortal and will live forever, from which it follows that they despise death, and many of them willingly undergo imprisonment. Moreover, their first lawgiver taught them that they are all brothers of one another, and when once they have sinned by denying the Greek gods and by worshipping that crucified sophist himself and living according to his laws, so they despise all things equally and regard them as common property, accepting such teaching without any sort of clear proof. Accordingly, if any quack or trickster who can pass himself off, who can press his advantage, comes along among them, he can acquire great wealth in a short time by imposing on simple-minded people." Well, uh, this is uh, this is what the enemies of Christianity are saying about the Christians. They're generous, they're sharing, they despise death. Uh, I hope that's what our enemies can say about us today. All right, but here's the joke. Peregrinus is exposed as a fraud and he's sent to prison. Punchline: the Christians continue to support him even in prison. All right, let's talk about the Mass in the early church. These were all home churches. Obviously, we didn't have church buildings. So um, Christians went to the temple or the synagogue on the Sabbath day. This is part of their Jewish origins. But on the Lord's Day, Sunday, they met in homes. Now, there was this growing tension between Christians and Jews, and they were rejected from the temple. That left only the Lord's Day service. But it also meant they lost their exemption from the military draft. The Jews were exempt from the draft for a bunch of complicated historical reasons. When the Christians got kicked out of the temple, then they now were subject to the draft, and this caused great problems. All right, the love feast. The service was called the agape meal or the love feast, and it was built on Roman and Jewish customs of fraternal meals, and it was in imitation of the Last Supper. So, wealthy members among them would bring fish or meat. The Eucharist would be consecrated and distributed, but in the context of a full meal. Problems began very early. Paul wants to end the communal meal portion of the ceremony because he thinks it just causes more problems. By the 90s, the Mass is completely separated from the love feast. So you would first have the Mass and then you would have the agape meal. Uh, Justin Martyr, whom we referred to earlier, describes the Mass pretty much in the form that we have it today. Okay, persecution. Well, why? Why were there persecutions? The Roman Empire was generally tolerant of local religions. Empires tend to be. They don't need any more problems with the locals than they have just by being conquerors. But Christianity was not local. Therefore, it was a threat to Roman rule. Now, in those days, you have to understand state and temple are not really separate in the way we think of them today. All right, so you had persecutions under Nero from 54 to 68, Marcus Aurelius from 161 to 81, Decius from 249 to 51, and Valerian from 253 to 60. Now, this means for long periods they were not persecuted, they were not thrown to the lions, but they were always subject to that possibility. Diocletian 283 to 305. Um, Diocletian, that would be the last, for at least for a while, because the Edict of Milan, which we'll go into later, uh, grants freedom to the Christians. But then we come to Julian the Apostate. This is an emperor who blames Rome's problems on this rising group of Christians. And he tries to reestablish paganism. So he rules from 361 to 363. It's a very short rule. Um, so he restored temples and properties to pagan cults because the Christians had taken over the pagan temples. Those impious Galileans not only feed their own poor, but also ours, welcoming them into their agape. They attract them as children are attracted with cakes. Again, these are the enemies of Christianity, pointing to the generosity of Christians. Okay, when this is what your enemies say about you, well, that's a pretty good thing. Well, Julian wanted the pagan priests to imitate the Christian priests. But see, that just didn't work. There is no principle in paganism that allows this. But the enemies of Christianity show us how it was perceived. And in a way, I think their testimony is the strongest testimony of what the early church was like. All right, now we go. Let me switch gears here. We're going to go from um, the we're going to go from the Acts of the Apostles, and now we're entering the realm of pure history. So, well, if I can get this to work, hold on just a second. Let me. I'm sorry for the technical screw ups, but there we are. Okay. So, I want to start out by talking about the themes of the historical study here. Um, it's political. A lot of it is political. It deals with church state relations. And always the question is who should rule? It's theological. And this will be the question of creeds, although I'm not going to get too deep into all the theological arguments. But I need to warn you from the beginning, this is not a good guys versus bad guys story, all right? Rather, it's about working out salvation in history. Sometimes the good guys are on the other side, and sometimes the bad guys, well, are our own people, our own popes, our own bishops. Here's the point I need to emphasize over and over again. We have the fullness of truth in Jesus Christ, but we do not have the fullness of get the fullness of understanding only by living the truth only in history. So let's start with Constantine, this fellow. Constantine legalizes Christianity by the Edict of Milan in 313. Now, Christianity had grown among the people, so they were now a real political force, even though they weren't in politics. The emperor at the same time becomes head of the church. You have to understand the emperor was head of the religious cult of Rome. Just that's just the way it was. So by making the church sort of the religious cult, well, the emperor becomes head of it. So it was the emperors, not the popes, that called the first seven ecumenical councils. Christianity at this time is a very, very urban phenomenon. In fact, the term pagan, in Latin pagani, well, it means a country person, a yokel, or a hillbilly, something like that. It's a term of derision because in the countryside, the paganism will survive for a long, long time, even late into the Middle Ages. Christianity becomes the state religion in 380. And paganism becomes punishable by death. The persecuted become the persecuted. Okay, but there are problems. The church becomes very, very subservient to the state. And then we have this problem. To which state? Remember, Constantine moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. So now you have two Romes. Which Rome is superior? Then there was an awful lot of conversion from, not from belief, but just from social pressures. If you want to be part of the court, if you want to do business at the court, if you want to be part of the social elites, well, maybe you should become a Christian. Then we get this Arian controversy. I'll address that a little bit, and the Council of Nicaea. Arianism is outlawed and it disappears within the boundaries of the empire. But Arian missionaries convert the barbarian tribes, the tribes who will soon invade um, Western Europe. We get the Nicene Creed from this. It's an answer to Arianism. Now, creed's kind of an innovative thing in religions. Um, the paganism really doesn't have creeds, things like that. It doesn't need them. They just believe in the myths, and you can interpret those myths as you will. Um, Only the cult was important, the liturgy, the public services. So, creeds now imply that there are certain things that you believe intellectually, um, and they provide a baseline for all the arguments. So they don't answer all the questions and are not meant to answer all the questions, but they are designed to define the minimum that you need to believe. Okay. Just, uh, a lot of changes to the liturgy and the sacraments come about through this because millions were now joining. Okay? And change is inevitable. So the home church is now impractical. Or even just getting a big hall is now impractical. You need a church and you need a church building and church architecture. So St. Justin Martyr gives us the order of the Mass in 130. That hasn't changed. But pagan customs are introduced. Incense, candles, bells, genuflection, kissing icons, facing east. All of these come from paganism. And the Mass was moved from a ceremony that took a liturgy that took place in the afternoon and was followed by the evening communal meal to a morning service. And one celebrated behind a screen because that's what both the Jews and the pagans did. So there was a veil across the altar. Um, but at the crucifixion of the Christ, the gospel describes the veil being split in two. And pagan services were also behind a screen because they had to be hidden from the common people, you see. And the priesthood now became a profession and a separate class. The priests um, were like the deacons today. They had another job, right? And uh, saying mass, taking care of the community was sort of a part-time thing. But they made their living other ways. Now they became a profession. And of course, now you had this need for church architecture because they hadn't needed architecture before. They had no buildings. Well, now it was different. They will develop a number of doctrines that we now consider standard, but at the time were new. Purgatory was one. Hell in the beginning is penitential, not permanent. That's why you had prayers for the dead. Prayers for the dead don't make any sense if hell is permanent, because the people in heaven don't need your prayers and the people in hell can't use your prayers. So there was sort of a universalism. It wasn't, I will say, universalism wasn't universal, but it was probably, it was a big part of the early church. Probably not everybody. Some were infernalists, believing that people would not get out of hell. Others, um, but most probably believed in universalism, that you could pray everybody out of hell. Okay. Um, so everybody would get out of hell, and then at some point they would enter heaven, and Christ would be all in all. But the Second Council of Constantinople locked the gates of hell. That's a real problem. What do you do with prayers for the dead? Hence, there arose this need for this third place, purgatory. The idea of purgatory starts in this period, and it becomes doctrinal in the 13th century. Another big change was confession. Originally, confession could only be done once. So all of your sins were forgiven at baptism, and then um, if you committed serious sins after that, you could get confession one time. Each diocese had a confessor who reported directly to the bishop. Now, this was confession was for serious sins, and it had serious penances. So things like hearing mass for a year on your knees, that could be a penance. And the absolution was granted only after completing the penance. And it was public rather than private. So, everybody could see the penance you were doing. And it was usually for public sins anyway. Um, all right, in the 7th century, Irish monks began to popularize the idea of frequent and private confession to a priest, uh, along with what's called tariffed sins. What do I mean by tariffed sins? Well, this particular sin, oh, that'll cost you 3 Hail Marys and an Our Father. Oh, that sin, that's more serious. That's going to be a whole decade. Oh, that sin, that'll be a whole rosary. That kind of thing. Okay. And they even publish manuals, confessional manuals, giving, it was like a tax table. By the 12th century, confession comes to be required once a year. Okay. All right. Invasion and collapse. The barbarians. Rome was disintegrating. It was disintegrating from within. It is not the barbarians who caused the collapse of Rome. Rather, it was things like debt slavery. When more and more people fall into debt slavery, well, their attachment to the empire becomes very weak indeed. And defense had already been outsourced to German mercenaries. So being in the army was not a patriotic duty, it became more like a business. And Well, the barbarians were the businessmen. Now, these barbarians were not pagans. They were largely Christians, but Arian Christians. Well, with the barbarian invasions, you had the loss of trade, you had the loss of commerce, you had the loss of urban life, you had the loss of education, etc. And then in 410, there was the sack of Rome. The barbarians sacked Rome, right at the heart of the empire, at least the Western Empire. And this was the collapse of the Western Empire. You see here a map of the invasions. Notice it's an invasion of the Western Empire. The Eastern Empire remains pretty much intact, but the Western Empire gets spread among all of these various invading tribes. However, by the 8th century, most of the barbarians had converted from Arianism to true Christian to Catholicism. Um, okay. Ah, then comes the rise of Islam. It begins in the very, very edges of empire. And it is rooted in the strict monotheism and in the idea of obedience. Now, some have viewed Islam as sort of a heresy off of Christianity. I think it's more accurate to think of it as a heresy off Judaism. And what do I mean? Judaism is rooted both in strict monotheism and in the idea of obedience. You obey the laws, the 613 laws. That idea is very, very strong in Islam as well. And it has a very, very simplified and easy to understand theology, at least compared to Christianity. They made amazing conquests in a very short period of time. Christianity was riven um, by a lot of internal problems, but also a lot of um, internal theological problems, but also just by a collapse of its wealth, of commerce, of learning, things like that. So, major Christian centers in Africa and the Middle East were gone. Think about this. Christianity used to be as much centered in the East as it was in the West. So, Syria, Babylon, Baghdad, Alexandria in Egypt, North Africa, all of these were Christian centers of Christianity, Christian learning, Christian writing, and Christian practice. Suddenly they were all gone. All right. In this period, there is kind of a triumph of the papacy. The collapse of the empire meant the collapse of the control of the church by the emperor. So by 361, Pope Damasus is able to claim primacy. But primacy over what? Now, there will be a continuing conflict with New Rome, Constantinople. Which city should be prior? As between the bishops of Constantinople, called the patriarchs, and the bishop of Rome, and all of the bishops, there's the principle of primus inter pares. The pope is primus inter pares, first among equals. However, uh, in the West, they will emphasize the primus. In the East, they will emphasize the pares. In the West, they emphasize the Pope is first, and in the East, they emphasize the Pope is equal. All right. But after the collapse, it's the church that has the only functioning bureaucracy, the only functioning way of administering cities. Then Pope Leo, during the invasion of the Huns, Pope Leo persuades Attila the Hun not to attack Italy. The papacy is now at the height of its prestige, of its influence. All right, let's talk about monasticism. And this begins, well, it has several origins, but the most well known one, and probably the most important, is the rule of Saint Benedict, beginning in Monte Cassino in Italy. So, Saint Benedict from 480 to 547. And he comes up with the rule of Saint Benedict. And this rule dictates communal living, just like as in the early church. There's no private property. They hold all things in common. They have democratic governance. So they live under the rule of an abbot that they themselves select. And this principle, ora et labora, work and prayer. This principle was revolutionary. Up till this time, having to work with your hands, was considered servile. And anybody who did actual work was considered very low class. Um, well, ora et labora elevated work to the level of prayer. It made it equal to prayer. It invested work with a new dignity that was totally absent from the ancient world. Democracy, the democracy that began in the monasteries would spread to the guilds. Now, the guilds were associations of people in the same profession. They governed themselves democratically and set prices, set working conditions, set educational standards, etc., democratically. It would then spread to the cities. The new cities, they established themselves as what's called corporations. Okay, self-governing corporation. The word doesn't mean quite what it means today. And they were democratically ruled. Eventually, the idea that the whole state had to be democratic grows from the rule of Saint Benedict. Now, this monastic movement will spread across Europe, and it constitutes a reform of society from the bottom up. The effects. The evangelization of rural areas. So there was not much of a rural priesthood, if any, but the monasteries work as evangelists to the countryside, to the pagans, to the yokels, to the country people. They also become centers of education. So the education systems had all collapsed. It is the monasteries that reestablish them. And there is a revival of commerce and town life because the monasteries are not just places of prayer, but places of work, places of production. There's a preservation of culture that takes place in the monasteries that might have disappeared without them. They have advances in production, in agriculture, in management. And in fact, if you really wanted an MBA at that time, you would go to a monastery, especially, I should say, a Cistercian monastery. The Cistercians were really, really past masters at managing a business. In fact, the Cistercians practically invent the factory system. Okay. It is a time of intense theological debates. The Gospels involve complex questions. Well, Christ is true God and true man. Well, what does that mean precisely? How could he be both true God and true man? This takes a lot of thought. And we worship Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We worship all three as gods, yet we are monotheists. So what does that mean? How can there be one God if we worship Father, Son, and Spirit? These and many, many other questions cause great debates, and they go on and on and on. I'm not going to go into detail on them, but needless to say, they're a staple of the early church and the church today. The most important one is Arianism, not theologically, but militarily, because it did the work the church should do among the barbarian tribes. But the most consequential questions concern salvation and free will. Here we want to talk about this fellow, Saint Augustine. Now, Saint Augustine was from North Africa, probably a Berber. Um, as a young man, he was a Manichaean. What does that mean? Well, Mani was this charismatic religious leader um, who taught dualism. Dualism, spirit is good and matter is evil. And there's this constant war between spirit and matter, which one day spirit will win. Well, this is a problem to a religion that teaches that God created the world and saw that it was good. So, all being in Manichaeanism is a war between spirit and matter, and there will be this great final battle when spirit will um, um, defeat matter and everything will be fine. And Mani claimed to be the last prophet after Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus, and he claimed to be synthesizing all three. The young Augustine was a very, very enthusiastic follower of Mani and a strict dualist. But on a visit to Milan, he is converted by St. Ambrose, the bishop of Milan, and writes a very moving autobiography of this conversion called The Confessions. This is probably the first autobiography in history. All right, so we go from the young Manichaean to the middle aged Catholic. Augustine is a powerful writer and preacher. He has 96 books, hundreds of sermons and letters. Returning to Africa, he is made Bishop of Hippo simply by popular acclamation. And he writes strong defenses of the church and especially of free will. He writes in Latin when most of the early fathers wrote in Greek, so he is more accessible to the general public. After the sack of Rome in 410, he writes The City of God, which um, places the city of God versus the city of man. It's a very excellent book for a lot of different reasons, but there's kind of a creeping Manichaeanism in the book. So the city of God on one hand and the city of man on the other. That's true in one sense, okay? Uh, but I'm not sure it's quite true in the sense Augustine meant it, as to put those things in permanent opposition. The point of the city of man is to become the city of God. All right, the aging Manichaean question mark. He has this huge fight with a man called Pelagius, and Pelagius is accused of denying the role of grace in salvation. He makes salvation totally our personal choice, something we're able to do by ourselves without the help of God. If that's really what Pelagius taught, that there's some debate on that, but that is at least the ideas that Augustine is arguing against. In doing so, he completely repudiates his own earlier works on free will. So for the younger Augustine, we have free will and have it absolutely and can choose to accept or reject God. For the older Augustine, we have no free will at all. Everything now depends on God's will alone. There is no free will. And original sin becomes somewhat different from the way it was originally understood. So in the Greeks, original sin is just gives you the early condition of man. Um, but with Augustine, it becomes an actual personal sin. You see the problem? Um, well, hence, unbaptized babies who have committed this personal sin, was as if they have committed this personal sin, they go straight to hell. Uh, And there is a strict predestination. We're all selected for heaven or hell by God Himself. We're selected even before the creation of the world, and we're elected without regard to merit. So, in this strict predestinationism, there's a few elect and a massa damnata. The mass of men are just damned to hell. It had nothing to do whatsoever with their own actions. It had nothing to do with their own choices. This was an election made by God before the beginning of time. God's decision is prior to knowledge of merit or demerit in anybody who's elected or not elected. Now, in my opinion, you'll hear other um, interpretations of this, but in my opinion, this is an old man returning to the ideas of his youth. Okay? Um, that's how I read it. However, you read it, though, the influence of Augustine is tremendous. In the earth, at least in the Western Church, in the Eastern Church, he is just totally rejected. But the Western Church, that's a different case. By the 9th or 10th centuries, Augustinianism dominates Western theology. And there is this great struggle to try to reconcile justice, predestination, and free will. How do you do that? Uh, you can see the medievals go through some very interesting twists and turns in their thinking, trying to put all of these things together. I'm not sure they're always successful. However, as we'll see much later, Luther, Calvin, Knox, all of the great Protestant leaders were strict Augustinians. And you can understand where they're coming from. Church, Augustinianism is in the Western church. It's very, very powerful. But Luther, Calvin, Knox, etc., feel that the church is really not fully faithful to that Augustinian tradition. And they're right. The church tries to reconcile, I think Western theology tries to reconcile impossibilities, in my opinion. So they try to sort of temper or downplay the worst aspects of Augustinianism, but Luther and Calvin adopt those aspects. And they reject any of the medieval attempts to compromise with Augustinian theology. Now, there is no Augustine in the East. He's just not read in the Orthodox Church. Uh, and, you have to ask, well, is this why the East doesn't have a Protestant Reformation in the same way that the Western Church did? Okay. What does this all mean for salvation history? The empire freed the church from the law. The fall of the empire freed the church from the empire and the emperor. But that battle will reemerge in new forms over and over and over again. Real reform comes from the bottom up, as with the monasteries. The institutional church protects the real church. What is the real church? We are. We are the ecclesia, the gathering of God's people. The ecclesia, um, again, a term from Greek politics, it means the assembly of the people. That's what the church is. I really don't like the English term at all because when we think of the English term, we think of a church, we think of a building. With ecclesia, you have to think of people, of the people gathered together. That's, for me, what the church is. And I want to point out, as we'll see throughout the study, the choices we make, the decisions we make have a real impact on history. We're not just isolated students of the scriptures. We act the scriptures out. We make the scriptures alive in our history, in our family's history, in our country's history. And that's how salvation history um, advances. Okay. Uh, I look forward to getting all together with you all. For those in the discussion group, put your questions in the comments here, but we will discuss it next Tuesday when we get back together. We had to cancel this Tuesday because of weather, but we'll discuss these next Tuesday. We'll start off with a discussion of these ideas. Those listening online, please feel free to put any comments you have in the um, in the comments, in the YouTube comments, and I will be more than happy to address them. So thank you all very much.